Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Faded Map, Lost Kingdoms of Scotland by Alistair Moffat, narrated by Neil Mcfarlane. Introduction. Very little certainty, only occasional phases of continuity, and hardly any clarity at all are the sorry string of characteristics to be found everywhere in this book. Scotland, or more precisely, North Britain in the Dark Ages, seems a tangle of confusion, a story told in sometimes contradictory fragments and a few rare flickers of light. From late in the last millennium BC to AD 1000 and even beyond, it is a tale of shadows and half-lit edges. Only the land, its rivers and lochs and the seas around it remain, and, although the appearance of Scotland has changed over the course of 1,000 winters and 1,000 summers since, its fundamental shape and scale have endured. The sands and the tides, the hills and high valleys, the great rivers, the long-lost wildwood, the impenetrable marshlands, and the ancient names of places have a rich story to tell. The land has its own certainty, continuity, and clarity, and, where it can, this book attempts to thread these into the weave of our early history. Such as it is, much of what we might recognise as a history of Scotland in the first millennium AD has been supplied by outsiders, Greek travellers, Roman military historians and mapmakers, Irish annalists, Welsh bards and chroniclers now thought of as English have left us most of what passes for a narrative in what follows. Much has been lost, and often it is the random discovery of an object, the recognition of a piece of dusty sculpture as great art, or the realisation that some of the men of the north of Britain were very influential in their time, that reminds us that a lack of a coherent history written by those who lived it is only an accident. Because records did not survive, we should not drift into the unthinking assumption that the society of Dark Ages Scotland was incapable of compiling them, and was therefore somehow primitive and less sophisticated than others. As a further discouragement, it should be made clear at the outset that the principal focus of this book is failure. The losers have, of course, been eclipsed by the winners in the history of Scotland. Excellent treatments of the rise of Dalriada, the Gaelic-speaking kings of the West, and their eventual takeover of the whole country exist. And the story of the Pictish kingdoms, one of the great mysteries of our history, has been investigated and exhausted by talented historians. The Scots and the Picts appear in this narrative only when they shed light on the peoples they defeated or subjugated. Instead, a dim light is shed on the forgotten dynasties that died away and failed. Their lost kingdoms are the proper subject of this book. Where were Calchvinith, Dane More, and Dane Eon, Manow, and the land of the kindred hounds? Who were the sons of prophecy, the Wellborn, Maxen, Amdark, the kings of Ebroc, and the treacherous Morkant Bulk? What happened at Ardereth, Degsaston, and Alt Clut? Where were the Grimsdyke, the land of the Hallower folk, the sanctuary of St. Gordian, the Wasteland, and the Raven Fell? Most of these lost or half-remembered names are to be found in the landscape, overgrown by ignorance, pushed to the margins of our history by events elsewhere. The limitations of this book are all too obvious, but its geographical limits require a little explanation. It is principally the faded map of southern Scotland, the lands south of the Highland Line. Those lost kingdoms that spoke dialects of Old Welsh are much discussed, and the final flourishes of the remarkably resilient Strathclyde Welsh close the narrative. The other significant language of lowland Scotland was, of course, English, and a concerted and extended effort is made to assert the Bernicians as one of Scotland's peoples. The arrival of their language and the glittering achievements of the dynasty of Aethelfrith are seen as a central part of Scotland's history. Bernicia is a kingdom lost to us in the pages of histories of England. Finally, a note on the boxed notes in the text. These deal with snippets of detail and related information, and are of incidental importance in a story which needs every bit of information it can find. It is to be hoped that in this book, the faded map of Scotland will acquire some colour once more. The story of our lost kingdoms is not merely a matter of footnotes for the curious. Failure has its own fascination. Losers in our history deserve our attention and perhaps our respect. Scotland was never inevitable. Chapter 1. Shadows. In February and March, the hungry months of the late winter, even the best fields are grazed hard, their grass pale and nibbled to its roots. Good farmers use every inch of pasture to nourish their pregnant ewes, and in the pillowy hills by the River Tweed, it is surprising to see a copse occupy a long stretch of good ground for no apparent reason. But it turns out that there is one. Deep in the tangle of briars and hawthorns, and surrounded by a rusty barbed wire fence, lies the shadow of an ancient kingdom. Perched on a south-facing hillside between Galashiels and Selkirk in the Scottish border country, the long and prickly copse hides a stone-filled ditch with a steep bank on its northern edge. The farmer has fenced it to keep curious lambs from injury and mischief, and left the scrub and tumbled tree trunks as a welcome shelter from the winter winds. Curious human beings who avoid becoming hanked on the barbed wire and push their way through the briar thorns will find themselves standing inside another time and another place. In the still of a summer evening, the dense canopy shades the lichen-covered stones of the ditch, and in the quiet glade there is a silence and the sense of a long past. Nothing appears to be artificial. There are no obvious marks of the work of men and women, and no signs of occupation. The deep ditch has been filled with stones picked up in the surrounding fields by generations of ploughmen and shepherds. None seems to have been carved or worked in any way. And yet this place was made by the back-breaking labour of many people, hacking soil and rock out of the earth with mattocks and picks, filling baskets, lifting them, carrying their loads to the bank above and piling the upcast ever higher. The ditch was deep, almost 2 metres in places, and, with the bank above it, the whole earthwork measured 6 metres across. This place was important. At least 14 centuries ago, the ditch and its bank marked a frontier, the limits of 2 of the lost kingdoms of Scotland. Known as the Catrail, the beginnings of the boundary have been traced a few miles to the north, near the banks of the Gala water by Torwood Lee. As it climbs up the steep slopes above the floodplain, the ditch circles a broch, a stone tower probably built in the last centuries of the first millennium BC, perhaps occupying the site of an earlier hill fort. Formed with immensely thick dry stone walls and circular in plan, the broch dominated the landscape, visible up and down the river valley, standing on a high and prominent spur. The frontier ditch skirted the great tower, and it may be that, at some point in an overlapping history, the strength of one was associated with the integrity of the other. After the line of the Catrail passes to the west of the modern town of Galashiels, it can be difficult to trace, often showing only as a shadow cast by early or late sun. When snow melts, the last of it sometimes lies where the old ditch has almost been ploughed out, or filled in by farmers, so that a slight depression is all that remains. As the Catrail reaches the tangled briar copse on the hillside between Galashiels and Selkirk, another tremendous fortification once reared up behind its line. On the summit of the ridge stands a plantation of spiky Norway spruces, surrounded by a circular dry-stone dike. Inside, screened by the evergreen trees, are the banks and ditches of an elaborate fort. Dug and palisaded sometime in the first millennium BC, it is known as the Rink. An odd place name, it is the stub of something longer and more revealing. Llangurig is, in part, an Old Welsh name, coined by the communities who lived in the borders before the arrival of English and the war bands, who spoke its 7th and 8th century versions. Many Old Welsh place names have survived. Peebles is from Pibilch, which meant a tent or a shelter, and probably referred to the sheilings of shepherds or farmers. Kelso is from Calcvinnith, meaning a chalky hill. In Wales there are many Llan names, and it usually refers to an enclosure. There is a persistent local tradition that the second element of Llangurig is a memory of a Gaelic-speaking Scottish king. Giric reigned in the late 9th century, and his war bands are said to have raided in the Tweed Valley. Perhaps they reused the crumbling ramparts as a base for harrying the countryside around. Below the Rink fortress, the frontier runs towards the banks of the Tweed, and is picked up again immediately on the other side. What makes it almost certain that the Catrail was not a road, but a boundary, is the fact that it does not seek to ford rivers or pay much attention to natural features. In two places, the ditch arrives at a sheer drop into a stream and carries on the other side. Elsewhere, its line goes from one side of a hill loch to the other, and it often goes straight up ridges with no attempt to find an easier gradient. Frontiers are the product of politics, of an agreement or bargain struck, or at least a settlement of some kind, often a compromise. Another place name suggests one. In the neck of the land between the Tweed and the Ettrick, before they meet below the Rink Fort, lies Sunderland. An English name, it signifies territory separated or sundered from a greater whole. The chronology may not fit, place names are difficult to date, but in Sunderland there is a sense of an important boundary nearby, one which could not include it for some lost reason. That reason may have been military. An alternative and equally plausible interpretation is that the construction of the Catrail was an act of war, rather than an agreed peace. The ditch was almost always dug on the eastern or southern side of the earthwork, and the bank raised to the north or west. That suggests that the Catrail was made to obstruct the advance of aggressors from the east, either mounted raiders or warriors on foot, and, if any did break through and had plundered cattle or other livestock, the ditch and bank would make it difficult for them to get away quickly with their stolen beasts. The fact that several powerful fortresses lie close to the Catrail is also eloquent. They are always sited in the west or north, and therefore behind the sheltering bank, and in turn that suggests strongly that this huge structure was thrown up by the peoples of the west and their kings. Offa's Dyke supplies useful analogies. Built by the great Mercian king in the 8th century, it was intended to inhibit raiding parties riding out of the Welsh hills. Although on a much larger scale than the Catrail, its principles are the same. There is a wide and deep ditch to the west, and a high bank on the east made from the upcast. At 150 miles in length, from the Severn estuary to the Dee, it was a vast project, the largest archaeological monument in Britain, and the most impressive man-made frontier in Europe. Land was the most precious asset our ancestors had, and kings did not hesitate to expend enormous energies to protect it. To the west of Selkirk, the Catrail is much harder to detect as it climbs into the hills above the Yarrow Valley. It may be that this long stretch was dug at a different period and guided by different authority. After crossing the river near the Yarrow Foos, the frontier swings south through the high wastes of the old Ettrick Forest, before becoming much more defined as it reaches the Borthwick water. Now engulfed by commercial forestry, the last few miles are, nevertheless, again emphatic. The ditch cut in long straight sections before terminating in the western ranges of the Cheviot Hills near Peel Fell. Earthworks are notoriously difficult to date. The most persuasive evidence for Offa having caused his dyke to be built during his reign, from 757 to 796, is to be found in Asser's Life of King Alfred. Written 100 years after the event, the biography contains only one relevant sentence. Offa caused a great dyke to be built from sea to sea between Mercia and Britain. The seas were assumed to be the Severn estuary and the Irish Sea, while Mercia was Offa's Midland English kingdom and Britain was what is now Wales, seen by contemporaries as one of the last redoubts of the British. Written evidence like this is precious, much prized by historians of the so-called Dark Ages, and yet it is not entirely accurate. The northern section of Offa's Dyke was never built, and to maintain its line to the Dee estuary and the Irish Sea, another huge earthwork, which lay a few miles to the east, was used. Known as Wat's Dyke, it is 40 miles long and was thought to be roughly contemporary with Offa's Dyke. But archaeologists have recently found a fire site under Wat's Dyke, which was reliably carbon dated to around AD 446, much earlier than the reign of Offa. No one has yet excavated the Catrail, and parts of its 58-mile length may have been dug at different times or reused older ditches and banks. Or the frontier may have been marked in different ways, and there were certainly substantial gaps where streams and steep slopes seem to have sufficed. But the continuous 110 miles of Offa's Great Dyke was certainly built in the second half of the 8th century, and it was thrown up quickly because of military pressure from the Welsh kings of the West. it seems highly likely that the Catrail had similar beginnings and for similar reasons. Solid, physically imposing frontiers were very familiar to the communities of southern Scotland. They lived between two mighty Roman walls, the Antonine, across the Forth Clyde Isthmus, and Hadrian's between the North Sea and the Irish Sea. But what was the military pressure in the western Tweed Basin that galvanised kings and lords to imitate the work of the legions? In the 7th century, English-speaking war bands began raiding in the north. Riding out of the newly established kingdoms of Bredicia in Northumberland and Deira in Yorkshire, these warriors and their kings were ambitious, anxious to gain territory and prestige, and successful in imposing overlordship in the Tweed Valley. In 603, a great general, Aethelfrith, led his war band to victory over the men of Aidan Mcfarlane, king of Dalriada. They fought at a place called Degsastan by the chroniclers, probably Addinston in Lauderdale. By 637, the English were laying siege to the seat of the old Welsh kingdom of the Godolphin at Dunedin, now Edinburgh. Not recorded are the forays they made to the west, to the fertile farms and fields of the upper Tweed, but make them they did, for the 7th century saw native kings shrink back into their upland fastnesses and try to stem the tide of English takeover. It is likely that these defeated, retreating rulers determined to draw a line through the border hills, the frontier which has become known as the Catrail. Further down the Tweed, English-speaking warlords were renaming the landscape. The old fortress at the junction of the Teviot and the Tweed, the strategic pivot known for centuries as Markadon, became Roxburgh, the stronghold of the English warlords called the Rook. Roxburgh is the smoothed-out modern version. Much closer to the Catrail, new settlements took a characteristic shape. At Midlem, originally Middleham, the village evolved as two rows of houses on either side of a central green, and with long backlands behind. These were cultivated for many generations and show up well in aerial photographs. At Selkirk, on the floodplain of the Ettrick, a powerful magnate built a hall for himself and his warriors. It has left its name on the town. Selkirk is from early English, and it means the hall church. Only the faint traces of the wallstead, a large rectangle, can be seen from the air, but the building was probably like its contemporaries. In the epic poem Beowulf, King Hrothgar sat in a great mead hall, meant to be a wonder of the world forever. It would be his throne room, and there he would dispense his God-given goods to young and old. The hall towered, its gables wide and high. To the west of the Catrail, few shadows remain. The kings of the west spoke Old Welsh to their warriors and their people, and the only recognisable legacy is the persistence of their ancient place names. Indeed, the frontier marks a striking division, even on a modern map. To the west, the landscape is speckled by many Old Welsh names. The poet and novelist James Hogg farmed at Ultreve in the Yarrow Valley. The older version is Eltref, which means old farmstead in early Welsh. Some names, like Berrybush, sound very English, but are not. Bar y Bwlch is the correct derivation, and it means the summit of the pass. Pen is Old Welsh for head or a high hill, and place names with pen abound in the western borders. Ettrick Pen, Penmanshiels, Pennygant Hill. As the line of the Catrail climbs west and up the Yarrow Valley, walkers come upon a much more substantial section. It bears an intriguing name, one which does more than hint at the purpose of the frontier. At first glance, Wallace's Trench sounds like a reference to the famous Scottish hero of the Wars of Independence. He campaigned in the borders, and, with his force of guerrilla fighters, hid in the wastes of the Ettrick Forest before being proclaimed Guardian of Scotland at the Forest Kirk in Selkirk. But why would a guerrilla fighter have his men dig a huge trench on the hillsides of the Yarrow Valley? Siege or attritional warfare was no part of Wallace's purpose. The historical reality is different and fascinating. Wallace's Trench long predates William, and indeed has nothing to do with his exploits, and everything to do with his name. In such records as survive, it is variously spelled as Wallensis, Walles, and Lewalais. All of these versions mean the same thing, William the Welshman. To the great relief of many patriots, he did not come from Wales, but Clydesdale, in the old and half-forgotten kingdom of Strathclyde, and his name probably recalls a native lineage which clung on to the Old language. In other words, they continued to speak a dialect of Old Welsh into the early medieval period. Wallace's Trench is therefore the Welshmen's Trench, part of the long boundary between a developing English-speaking culture to the east and an ancient Celtic speech surviving in the hills to the west. Place names support this interpretation, and there is a striking clutch of them around Wallace's Trench. One in particular suggests a military tone. Tinnis occurs 4 times, and it derives from the Welsh dinas, meaning a fort. And rising up west of the trench is Welsh's law, probably a blunt later echo of old differences. Power names places, and, when the English war bands penetrated far up the Tweed and Teviot valleys, their lords reordered the map. Many Welsh place names gave way to new English names, especially when these were centres of wealth and prestige. At Sprowston, a small village on the southern bank of the Tweed, near Kelso, there was a Royal English township. Sometime around 657, it was visited by a great man, probably King Oswiu of Northumberland, the overlord of Britain, or Britwalda. Sprowston is a very early English name, after a man called something like Sprow, but the fact that it was a royal settlement with a great hall speaks of consolidation and firm ownership. If the Catrail was the frontier between Celtic and English kingship in the borders, it lay far to the west and recognised that the fertile riverlands of the plains had fallen to the invader, and the hill country was all that was left to the defeated. It is possible to hold up a map of Scotland and see the faint watermark of its lost kingdoms. Long earthworks pattern the landscape, running through fields, climbing hillsides, apparently leading nowhere, and enigmatic names remember the grass-covered undulations of ancient fortresses. Again, in the borders, there is an elaborate structure known as the military road. It runs for about 4 miles, and is not a road or track, but an elaborate sequence of 2 banks and 2 ditches, the deposit of tremendous and well-organised labour. Historians have conjectured its construction to the 1st millennium BC, and believe it to be related to the great hill fort on Eildon Hill North. The military road seems to guard the southwestern approaches to the hills, and its function may have been to slow down an attack, or prevent the rapid escape of raiders laden with plunder long enough for defenders to reach it. In Perthshire, archaeologists have uncovered the Roman frontier of the Gask Ridge, a series of watchtowers strung out in a line between Dunblane and Perth. Probably built by the legions commanded by the governor of Britannia, Petilius Cerealis, sometime around AD 73, it appears to have followed a pre-existing tribal boundary. To the west and north of the Gask Ridge ruled the kings of Caledonia, while to the east, occupying Fife and Kinross, lay the territory of the Viniconese. Their Latinized name has been brilliantly parsed by an American scholar, and it translates as the Kindred Hounds. Sometimes the memories of lost kingdoms are substantial, well documented, and remnants survive. Strathclyde lasted until 1014, when one of its last kings, Owain, was killed in battle with the English at Carham on the banks of the Tweed, and lingered almost certainly as late as 1070, when, according to one source, it was violently subjugated by the kings of Scots. Others are little more than a few scattered fragments of a jigsaw. The kingdom of the Wildcats was undoubtedly powerful on both shores of the Murray Firth, and its soldiers were willing to fight in its name as late as 1746. At Culloden, Clan Chattan fought with hopeless savagery. One of their captains, Gillis McBean, killed 14 government soldiers before his leg was shattered by grape shot. When dragoons cornered the wounded man by a dry-stained dyke, McBean fought like a man possessed before being trampled by English horses. But who were the Wildcats? Caithness is named for them. Gales called the Duke of Sutherland Morercat, his coastland Macarcat, and the hill country Monadhcat. Perhaps the most amazing survival is the kingdom of Manaw. Its heartland lasted until 1974, in the shape of Clackmannanshire, Scotland's smallest county. Ignored by all but antiquaries, its talisman stands next to the old county buildings in Clackmannan. Clackmanaw is the Gaelic version of the original name for the stone of Manaw, the core of the ancient kingdom and the derivation of Clackmannan. These are not Ruritanian curiosities. The lost kingdoms of Scotland remember not only who we were before we thought of ourselves as Scots, but, in so doing, they help unpack a much richer identity. They also remind us of political possibilities. If the Gaelic-speaking kings of Argyll had been less aggressive and less lucky, we might have lived under the rule of the Strathclyde dynasty, and we might have been worrying about the health of our native Welsh speech community, or how fewer and fewer in the north were now speaking Pictish. What follows reveals that Scotland was indeed never inevitable. The Kingdom of Moray. The ancient Kingdom of Moray, or Moreb, an Old Welsh name meaning low-lying land by the sea, was much larger than the modern county of Moray. Almost certainly the descendant of the Pictish kingdom of Fidach, it extended around both shores of the Moray Firth, running from Buchan in the east, taking in the lower Spey, Inverness, and the north of the Great Glen, and circling north up to Caithness. Even further back in history, it encompassed the old territories of the Cat people, what became the Confederacy of Clan Catin. A kingdom centred on the sea and the firth it bordered, its southern land frontier was the Grampian Massif, and the point near modern Stonehaven, known as the Mount, where the Massif almost reaches the shore of the North Sea. Two kings of Moray are noted in the Icelandic sagas in the 10th century, Maelsnechtai and Maelcolum. These are Gaelic names and scions of a vigorous dynasty. The most famous king of Moray became king of Alba, or Scotland, and ruled between 1040 and 1057. This was Macbeth, a much more successful ruler than Shakespeare's drama allowed. Kings of Moray were seen as serious rivals to the line of Malcolm Canmore, and in 1130, his son, David I, MacMalcolm, finally annexed the Old Kingdom. He brought groups of settlers from the royal lands around the Tweed, and these plantations were made on good land along the southern coasts of the Moray Firth. David I's policy created a linguistic frontier which can still be heard today. Between Inverness and Elgin, the local accent changes noticeably. This is because those from Inverness speak English learned by their Gaelic-speaking ancestors from the recent past, while those to the east came from the south in the 12th century and were already English speakers. Chapter 2. The Faded Map. Sometime around 320 BC, almost certainly in the benign months of the summer, a Greek explorer and scientist visited the land that would become Scotland. Pytheas had travelled an immense distance, beginning his remarkable and little-known journey at the prosperous trading colony of Massilia, modern Marseille. He came north in search of knowledge, business opportunities, and excitement. All three were recorded in On the Ocean, written on the traveller's safe return to the warmth of the Mediterranean. This fascinating book has been lost for almost 2,000 years, and all knowledge of it is derived from passages used in the surviving texts of later classical authors. None of these scholars had visited Britain or Scotland, and all of them depended on Pytheas' first-hand account. Some only included excerpts to mock him, calling him a liar and a fantasist. It was well known that human beings could not live in the hostile climate of the far north, and the Greek explorer had simply made it all up. Others believed him intrepid, and still more plagiarized his work without attribution. From an aggregate of all these references, and some reasonable assumptions, it is possible to trace the voyage of Pytheas, and even glimpse an occasional sense of what he saw. As a serious scientist, Pytheas carried with him instruments capable of very accurate measurements, and possessed enough geographical knowledge to translate his observations into data. At midday, with a cloudless sky, he could calculate the height of the sun, and this allowed him to work out how far north he had travelled from Marseille. These measurements were later expressed as latitudes, and in turn showed where Pytheas had been when he made them. One was almost certainly recorded on the Isle of Man. From there he sailed up through the North Channel, his shipmaster no doubt avoiding the boiling tide rips off the Mull of Galloway, where the Atlantic surges in to meet the Irish Sea. Likely to have hugged the coast, both to take on regular supplies of fresh water and readily find safe night anchorages, early sailors were very reluctant to travel in darkness. Captains preferred to voyage in short stages, and Pytheas slowly threaded his way up through the archipelagos of the Inner and Outer Hebrides. His ship made landfall at the Point Peninsula, on the eastern coast of the Isle of Lewis. That was where he made his last measurement of the sun's height, at the northern latitude of 54 degrees and 13 minutes, somewhere near the town of Stornoway.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?